David joined AP Tech in 1996 and is currently the firm's chief engineer. His technical efforts are focused in preventative maintenance and preservation, evaluation and design projects for both highways and airfields, technology transfer for pavement design, maintenance and rehabilitation, and pavement research. He has 30 years' experience providing consultant engineering services across the United States and around the world. Please join me in welcoming David Peshkin.
Thank you, and as you can see, I'm not the ogre wearing the belted sweater. There were probably some in my closet at one point, but it's been a few years. So thank you all for joining us today. It's hard to follow Mark, but somebody has to do it. My presentation today is focusing on a project on pavement preservation on highly trafficked roads or highly traveled roads. And I called it the new normal. As I think about it, maybe it's really, the subtitle should be On the Road to the New Normal. We can debate whether we're there or not, and maybe you have your own opinions on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background research that led up to where we are today. It's a project called Sharp, from Sharp to R26, which after the completion of the project was then picked up by FHWA and AASHTO for implementation. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about the research and then move on to talk about the implementation and maybe some of the next steps. So first, a little bit of the background. So in starting this project, there was a perception that pavement preservation for many people, many agencies, is associated with low volume roads. And in particular, we see treatments, probably the classic is the chip seal, where there could be widespread consensus that a chip seal is a highly effective treatment for pavement preservation. Oh, by the way, it's effective on low volume roads. It really isn't used on high volume roads. And so that may be the best example, but even other things like crack sealing or the scrub seals that Mark just mentioned, or slurries or micros, I think for many agencies there's the idea that, yeah, these are great tools in the toolbox, we just don't use them on higher volume roads. And maybe we can look at the reasons a little bit later. So the treatments themselves are perceived as, by many, as low volume road treatments. At the same time, there was an acknowledgement that for all the people that say these treatments are only good on low volume roads, there are agencies around the country that are using these treatments on higher volume roads and using them successfully. And I would say a lot of that success can be attributed to following some of the practices that you just heard about from Mark. Really best practices in terms of picking the right projects, using the right materials, having a contractor who's able to do a good job, going through the appropriate steps to make sure that that treatment is placed properly. So we have these two things. On the one hand, preservation, a lot of the treatments perhaps are low volume road treatments. On the other hand, there are people who are already violating those assumptions and doing this on all their roads. So when we started this project on this Sharp 2R26 project, we did something that is typically done in research projects. We went out and surveyed practices around the country, sent a questionnaire to a bunch of agencies. If you're one of the people that responded to that, we really thank you. We tend to send out lengthy questionnaires that require a lot of your time to respond to. And so a couple of the questions that we asked were related to what treatments you use, where you use them, how you think about how you define low volume roads and high volume roads, and so on. So here are some of the responses, some of the considerations in treatment selection, We always hear that safety is probably of primary importance, the cost of the treatment, the durability or life of the treatment. What we saw was that traffic volume, which was the focus of our study, wasn't really a high priority, at least in the minds of the people who responded to the survey. We also asked what they used preservation to treat. We didn't focus just on asphalt or concrete. We obviously covered them both, and you can see the responses here. One of the surprising things that we learned in our survey was that there was anything but a consensus on what a high volume road is. So we had responses ranging from 1,000 or 1,500 to 100,000. Obviously, you can think about different parts of the country and see how you might get some of those different responses. And what we took away from that is, and the other aspect of that was there really was no formal definition, even in agencies that responded. They didn't have a chart that said this is high volume, this is low volume, and yet people were still making decisions about, oh, we don't put this treatment on a road with an ADT above 1,500 or 2,000 or 5,000 or whatever. So to move forward, we had to pick a number based on the responses. And what we did was looked at we separated into rural and urban. We looked at the average of the responses. So at the 50% above, 50% below. And it happened to come out to some pretty even, and I would say even reasonable numbers. On rural roads, high traffic volume was, we ended up picking a number of 5,000 ADT, and on urban roads, we picked a number of 10,000 ADT. So in the absence of a well-defined value elsewhere, that's what we used moving forward. We then asked agencies about what treatments do you use based on that definition that was developed about a high volume road. And so we came up with widely used and not so widely used treatments on asphalt pavements and on concrete pavements. And you can see here for the asphalt pavements what was identified as widely used. And not a lot of surprises here. The most commonly used treatments were crack sealing, thin overlays, mill and overlay, drainage preservation. Treatments that were not very commonly used included fog seal, slurry, cape, scrub, chip, cold in place, hot in place, ultra thin, white topping. So we gave a lot of choices, we got a lot of answers. Doing the same thing for concrete treatments, you can see the same sort of responses. And again, I would suggest to you that there probably are not a lot of surprises here. A lot of experience on high volume roads with some of the common concrete pavement preservation treatments, and maybe less experience with some of the not so common treatments. So we collected all of this information and we put it together into two documents as part of the R26 project. One was the traditional project report, said what we did, how we did it, a lot of the background on the project. Probably the more useful and more appropriate for dissemination to agencies considering this was the guidelines for preservation on high traffic volume roadways. And the guidelines describe what people are using, what people are using successfully, provides some variables to consider in treatment selection and project selection, and puts all of this into a selection process and framework so that other agencies could take this information and perhaps use it to start applying preservation treatments on high volume roads that they weren't already considering. And I want to emphasize that really the underlying premise in this project, again, was that for everybody who said we would never consider doing preservation on high-volume roads, there were already 5 agencies, 10 agencies, even more, who were doing it. I mean, much as Mark said, when one agency says, we won't do this, there may be neighbors next door, the next city, the next county, the next state, who are doing it, who have been doing it, who have been successful, and the treatments really don't know much about state borders. They cross the lines pretty well. And so this study was really about sharing the information based on the agencies who have been doing preservation without as much of a focus on some sort of arbitrary traffic limit, doing preservation on all their roads, and sharing that information with the agencies that might want to consider it but need a little more assistance in figuring out how to do it. So that was really what the R26 project was about. So in the guidelines document, there's a step-by-step process that helps to identify appropriate repair techniques. There's also a tool on how to consider other factors, decision matrices for how to extract this information, and some examples about how to use this guidance. So I don't want to bore you with the types of slides where the initial comment is, I know you can't read this. It's just to say that it's a step-by-step process that one goes through to first determine if the pavement is a candidate for preservation, to consider other variables about conditions, the overall condition, smoothness, any friction problems. Use those as inputs to determine whether or not the pavement's a candidate for preservation, and if it is, to identify the feasible preservation treatments that would address the conditions that you've specified. Then the second part of the decision process looks at specific project needs and constraints, such as what sort of life do you need to get out of it, what sort of risk is associated with this job, are there construction constraints, and all of that goes into the selection of the final recommended treatment. So that's the background on the R26 project, and from here my heading slides get a little out of whack. I'm going to talk about implementation next instead of outreach. So this project ended sometime after belted sweaters went out of favor, I think around 2011, 2012. And in late 2012, 2013, it was picked up for implementation. For those who aren't aware, FHWA and AASHTO were charged with taking all of the SHARP 2 studies that were done in all sorts of areas, not just pavements, not just preservation, and moving them forward with support for implementation. This was one of the first projects out of the block. It had a lot of appeal to AASHTO agency directors, and it was ready to go. It got money, and implementation began. Agencies submitted applications to receive a really nominal amount of funding. It probably averaged around $100,000. 14 agencies were selected and received this money, and the objective in implementation was that these agencies would use the SHARP R26 guidelines to select a pavement or pavements for preservation, place those treatments, and then use what they learn to maybe help to improve their preservation practices on high-volume roads. You can see from this list the agencies that received funding, and each of them approached it a different way. I would say that they probably all did not use the R26 guidelines to select projects or treatments. Maybe some of them made a good faith effort. I know not all the treatments were placed on roads that had what we would classify according to that scheme I presented to you as high volume road traffic levels, but they were close, and if they didn't hit that level, they had a reason, they had some intent in what they selected. So at least there was some purpose. Just a quick overview on a few of the agencies that move forward. Kentucky put down 8 treatments on US 127. So they really conducted a mini preservation experiment, if you will. So they had a control section and they put down a lot of different treatments. And Kentucky was not a state that had a lot of experience using preservation treatments other than asphalt overlays. And this really gave them the opportunity to try many different things. They probably have the broadest experiment in terms of the number of treatments and the extent to which they did this. So you can see what they had here, and I think it's a pretty interesting experiment that they put down, and I believe they're still monitoring performance. Massachusetts, Ed Neris is here somewhere, and he really spearheaded Massachusetts program on US 3. They put down 10 different test sections, focusing on a ultra-thin bonded wearing course as on the mainline pavement, but with a number of different variations in that surface. And they used fog seals on the shoulders and modified fog seals, and did a control section using conventional materials. So again, this was something that was a little bit different from what they would typically do, and also gave them an opportunity to branch out and try some variations that industry was proposing to see how they would work. Pennsylvania also put down a number of different treatments. They did a thin overlay with and without fiber modifiers, microsurfacing using 3 different systems, and a thin asphalt rubber gap graded overlay as well. Again, they tried a number of different test sections. And then there were agencies that only put down 1 treatment, or maybe 1 treatment and a control at best. So certainly a range in practice was observed from those 14 agencies. The one agency that was not like all the rest was Minnesota. They did not put down any treatments at all. They used their funding to host a national workshop and essentially a demonstration project. They've been putting down preservation on higher volume roads. They invited everybody out for a series of speakers and a trip to Min Road to see their chip seal and other treatments that were placed on I-94 with about 25,000 ADT. So that was a very interesting demonstration. And again, I think it highlights that point for everybody who thinks, as an example, and probably the most common example, that a chip seal is a low volume road treatment, that it's something you don't put on a road above 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 or whatever your number is in your agency, that it's a treatment that isn't appropriate for high volume roads. There's somebody that's doing it, that has it as part of their toolbox and has been doing it successfully. And I think that that visit to Min Road and that chip seal, the really high quality chip seal that they had down on I-94 was an eye-opener. So outreach. I think that's the next part, yeah. Oh, and by the way, so those treatments, those 14 agencies, I think the first one was put down within a month of receiving funding. Pennsylvania was the first out of the gate in 2013, and the last was Washington, D.C. I think they're the last. They were placing their treatments, some microsurfacing and some city streets in D.C. about 2 weeks ago. So that implementation, those experiments have really been stretched out. So that was the funding part of it. That was the funding to agencies to help them to try things that they might not otherwise try. There were also other outreach activities. So as part of the program, FHWA and AASHTO supported workshops where presentations around the country were given and are still being given on the background of preservation, especially preservation on high volume roads, discussion of some of the tools that are available, some of the local challenges, the benefits that agencies are experiencing, and marketing, outreach, so all sorts of things in that manner. They had also envisioned showcases. We held one showcase at Massachusetts in conjunction with the initiation of that work on US 3. We learned that the problem with showcases is that it's hard to coordinate advanced planning to bring out a number of different agencies to be there when the work is being done, when the work is very contractor dependent, weather dependent. So we ran into just timing issues in doing that. And we've moved more toward showcase discussions, really focusing around presentations from the agency about what's been done rather than going out and watching construction. Another successful outreach effort has been peer exchanges. There have been a number of them that have been completed and more are planned. And this is where we're going around the country to regions, bringing in neighboring states and talking about their preservation programs, what's working, what's not, allowing agencies to share their experiences with each other and hopefully improve their practices. As part of the implementation effort, we've also developed a number of tools or outreach tools beyond the guidelines that were in R26. One is a little report on data collection. How do you evaluate a pavement for consideration of whether it's a good candidate for preservation? How do you evaluate performance of the treatments themselves? Implementation guidelines. So we wrote the report, we wrote the guidelines document, and then you know how you might encounter people with a shorter attention span than a researcher. They say, could you shorten it up? Could you give us something a little briefer? So we condense it all down into a implementation guide that's a fraction of the length of the report, and that then becomes the report. And I think what they really want is for us to shorten it up into a one-page summary. So, to take a couple hundred pages and put it into one page that matches attention spans. I don't know that we're going to get there. But the third thing that we developed was an implementation tool. This is something we're in the process of completing. And it takes the flow of decisions and the matrices of various conditions and treatments and puts it into an Excel spreadsheet that you can go and enter information and extract recommendations on the treatment. So it in effect automates or semi-automates some of the decision process in something that you can have on a laptop and again, maybe shortcut reading all the report and other information. I just want to mention briefly some of the other outreach activities. There are a number of case studies, agencies that have been written up as to what their issues were, what their concerns were, and how they're addressing those through the R26 implementation effort. We hold quarterly user calls with those implementing agencies to get updates on the status of their projects and lessons learned. And there's also been, there's a group in DC that's working on marketing of the project and putting together pamphlets on preservation, high volume roads, and other tools that could be helpful in improving practices. This project also received a second round of implementation funding, and that was just awarded a couple months ago. Three more states were selected, Washington, West Virginia, and New Jersey, and nothing's moved forward on that, but if I had to group them all together and say what the implementation efforts would look like there, I would say it revolves around training and getting the message out either internally or broadly internally to help promote their preservation practices. So the new normal, what is the new normal? I guess I would contend that roads don't really know whether they're high volume or low volume, in the sense that low volume and high volume roads are often built with the exact same materials. They're exposed to the same environmental conditions. Obviously, the one big difference might be the number of vehicles going over that road. So the point here is that all roads are candidates for preservation. And certainly there are factors that might limit you in what you put on a high volume road. Certainly one of those factors is risk, the fear of failure. I think Mark did a good point about talking about failure. On a high volume road, maybe we have the same risk of failure, we're just going to impact a lot more people if it occurs. Still, we can do it right. There's a lot of experience doing it right, and I would suggest that there's no reason why we can't be successful. So I would say the first step in the new normal is considering that preservation is appropriate for all roads. Making sure you have the right tools in the toolbox is part of the new normal. A toolbox does not consist of a single tool that you use over and over again, no matter what the condition. And that's true whether it's a low volume road or a high volume road. There are many different treatments that can be used. I guess I would again echo Mark's thoughts about talking to industry. Look at what other agencies have done. Look at what industry is proposing. Ask if you've got some high volume roads that are good candidates for preservation. In terms of the implementation and outreach, I'm reminded of some of the discussions that occurred when we first started the implementation efforts associated with this project. And FHWA and AASHTO talked about reaching some sort of saturation level or some critical threshold where preservation on high volume roads could be identified as the new normal and the standard practice. And I think what they came up with was there would be about, in that new normal, there would be about 35 agencies that were doing this as standard practice. And I'm not sure we're there yet, but I think we're well on our way, as evidenced by the number of agencies that are involved in implementation, and even what I hear from a lot of the agencies that are not. So some other aspects of the new normal: getting longer life out of pavements, and certainly out of pavements with preservation applications. I heard a lot of good ideas in Mark's presentation. I think there are a lot of knowledgeable people in the room at the conference, and certainly a lot to be learned from everybody else. Continue to work with agencies to extend the use of preservation, especially on high volume roads. Again, I don't think roads know the difference other than the traffic levels, and a lot of the treatments that could be used can work on either low or high volume roads. Identify what we don't know and do what we need to do to close those gaps. If you're interested in any of the documentation, the reports are available online. AASHTO and FHWA both have websites devoted to R26. I think at the AASHTO website, you can download the data collection guide. That's where the case studies are, and you can get the reports and the guidelines document from either site. So that concludes my presentation. I don't know if there is any time left for...
In terms of treatment selections, has there been any consideration given to the history of the selected road and the structural capacity of it, whether from FWD data or whatever is available? Thanks.
So good question. So in treatment selection, I guess some of the things to look at, so this is sort of the overall graphic, and I would say on the right-hand side, review historical design, construction, maintenance. So that would suggest look at what's been done in the past. And certainly a very good point, you need to evaluate, in determining if a pavement's a good candidate for preservation, you need to know something about the structural capacity of that pavement. If it doesn't have the structure to carry the loads that are being applied, it's not a good candidate for preservation. Preservation doesn't add structure, very fundamentally. So all of this, in selecting the projects, the premise is that the road is in good condition and that it's properly designed and constructed to carry the traffic that's being applied to it, but it's wearing out due to environmental conditions, aging of the materials and so forth. But underlying that surface is a good structure that will support what you do on top. Anything else? All right, thank you. Thank you.